We'll now start content part and content type development. So we will create a content part from code and we'll use it in a content type also from code. This will be first the very basics and then we'll start building up from there. So what we'll do is that we'll talk about person content items. Of course, you know, the object-oriented programming example is always something with people or animals. And indeed, we'll talk about people. We'll have person content items, person page content items, to make it more exact. And we'll have a person content part that will contain, well, properties corresponding to what a person, but data a person might have, like name, whether they are right or left-handed, and so forth. We'll create the content part from code. We will also use it in a content type in the same piece of code. It will automatically apply to our application, and then we will be able to see from the admin what actually happened. So, how you start is pretty much always with the content part class, because, well, you know, that's our model. Still, we are in the MVC paradigm. So we commonly also put content parts into the model's namespace and folder. And really modeling your entity like this is probably the most straightforward first step. So you will have a person part here. And again, we can use code snippets. Still, it will be fairly simple, but we can use the OC part snippets here. And spoiler alert, we also have a couple of other snippets for parts, which we will use later. So this will be a person part. As you can see, content part class is nothing really special except that it needs to derive from content part. And let's model our person items now. So as I said, they will have a name. So let's add a string name property here. Properties just as usual. Let's also add a property for handedness. So handedness as in right or left-handed. We won't talk about ambidextrous people yet. And for the handedness, let's use an enum to spice things up a bit. So I will use an enum here, which will be handedness. And we'll have left and right-handedness. All right, so that should be here instead. And also to spice things up a bit, not to have just simple string and integer properties here, we also have a datetime. And we'll have a datetime because we will store the birth date of the person. And that needs to be nullable because, you know, in the end, this is stored in SQL. Sometimes these entities are updated before actually having a value. So we'll need to have that as nullable. And let's call this birthdate UTC. Again, it's highly recommended to store date timestamps in the database as UTC, so in the universal coordinated time, because then that's a common denominator there. If you want to display the date to the user in their own time zone or somehow use the timestamp in another time zone, you will be able to convert from UTC to that time zone. But it's very straightforward. You will know that always when you have a timestamp in the database or stored anywhere else, it's in UTC, so there are no mismatches. Orchard does the same, of course. And finally, to spice things up a bit even more, we also have a biography, and the biography will be stored in a text field. Text field as in the content field, named text field, which is actually coming from the built-in Orchard module, orchardcore.fields. So we'll use that, but that would be fairly simple here with a text field and biography, but we don't really have access to text field here because, well, none of these are good matches, because we will need to add the text reference to the text to the fields module too. So well, actually a bit of clarification here. We will use the text field to store the biography here. Remember that a field is always attached to a content part. Not a content type, but a content part. And that also means that when you create a content part like this from code, you can also attach fields to it. And that works quite well. Nothing really to add there. But you can also add kind of a shortcut to the fields on that content part like this. So what I'm doing here with this text field property, you are not actually obligated to do. You would get away without it, just declaring that your field needs to be on this content part, which we'll also do in a so-called migration class. But nevertheless, generally it's a good practice to have such a shortcut property, because then if you are managing your content items with this content part from code, then it's easier to access that field, which we'll also see. And if you don't need such a property, you would actually get away without adding the package reference to Orchard Core fields, but we'll have this shortcut, so let's also add the reference. Unfortunately, no abstractions project here, so you need to take a hard reference on the fields module. So, orchardcore.fields, content fields, sorry, and yeah, it's the RC2 release. We accept everything. And while we are at it, we will also need to add this module as a dependency to the manifest file. So once I have this imported here, the namespace, I will actually go there and add this in the manifest too as a dependency. So now we'll have another module here. By the way, it's a general good practice to keep these dependencies alphabetically ordered, but in the end it's up to you. Alright, so now we have the text field here as well. So far so good. Now we have modeled our content part class. That's a good beginning, but it's not enough yet, not nearly enough. The next step will be to make this part actually available in the system. And there is one very crucial, but very small step necessary here, and that's registering it as a dependency in the startup folder here, startup class here. We haven't yet done anything in our startup class, so now it's a good time. So again, the startup class is pretty much the same as the startup class in an ASP.NET Core web project. This is where you configure all the basic services, register dependencies. You can define routes here. You can add middlewares to the pipeline. So all the usual low-level stuff. And what you need to do here all the time in an Orchard module is registering dependencies. And well, we'll need to add our content part here as a dependency too. And actually how you add the content part is not like a simple scoped service or something like that, but rather with a part registration, and we actually also have a snippet for that, this OCServe CP, as in Orchard Core services part. And the method that you need to use to register a content part is this add_content part. So I will also add this. Oops. And we also need to import the namespace. And so far so good. There is one more thing needed here though, and that will be a migration class. Right now we have our content part, and Orchard will know about this content part. However, we won't really be able to interact with it from the admin because it won't show up pretty much anywhere. So the next thing will be to make this part attachable. That means that from the admin you will be able to attach it to a content type. And secondly, we'll also create a content type with it, which will be person page. So let's actually do that. And now we will create a new namespace and folder here called migrations. And in this namespace, we will add a migrations class. What's a migrations class? Well, sometimes from your module you have to apply, let's call it data schema changes, which can actually be schema changes to the SQL database, to the SQL schema, and also schema changes in the content definition. And there is a nice mechanism in Orchard to make that automatic, and not just automatic, but also versioned, so you can make incremental schema changes in subsequent versions of your module. The migrations classes are for this. So, without further theory, let's look at it in action, and we will understand everything in detail when time comes. Again, we can use a snippet, so I will actually use that. And there is a basic migration class snippet, which is sometimes also useful, but in this case, we will actually use the content migration snippet, which is a migration class for content types, content parts, or anything where you change the content definition. Yeah, so we have now a person migrations class. As you can see, this such a migrations class has to derive from data migrations. And if you want to make changes to the content definition, you also have to inject a content definition manager, as you can see here. We also need to register this as a dependency, so before forgetting it, I will just quickly register it here. And this will be a normal scoped service registration. So we also have a snippet for that, but the registration itself is just as usual in ASP.NET Core or in the .NET Core dependency injection framework or container. So, just add scoped. And add scoped will need to be a registration for iData migration. Yes, and the implementation will be, well, our present migrations class. All right, and now let's go back to the migrations. You see that we have such a create method here. What is happening here? Migration class is, as I said, a way to apply incremental changes to the database schema or to the content definition. And the operative word here is incremental. You can add changes, and then in a next version of your module, you can add new changes or change what you have added before. You can create tables, drop tables, create and delete content type definitions, whatever. And of course, all of these incremental changes have to start somewhere, and the start is with a create method. So when you have a create method in your migration class, Ocean will know that, okay, this is the starting point, and it will automatically call this the next time you run the application. So once I'm finished with the migration class here, and I will start the application, what I write into this create method will be automatically applied. And then you can also write updates, which we'll do a bit later. So two things needed here. First of all, we need to make our content part attachable, as I said. And secondly, we also want to create a content type with it called person page. So let's actually do that. The content parts configuration or definition change will also happen with a snippet. We have an OC alter part definition snippet, which is a basic snippet for a content definition manager operation that, well, changes a content part definition. Even if it's the first time for this content part, you need to call this alter part definition. And the content part will be person part, of course. Do note that the first parameter of this alter part definition should be, well, the name of the content part. And then the second parameter here is, or second argument here is the actual code that will execute the alteration. We are using name of here, so instead of writing the string person part as the name of the part, we are using this name of practice. This is quite useful because this way you, well, first of all, you don't make a typo, and secondly, if you rename your part, due to refactoring, this will also change automatically. Now, it's not actually this easy to just change the name of a content part that was already configured in a content definition manager, but nevertheless, this is quite useful even if you only quite utilize it in the beginning. So now we can actually apply changes to our content part. And first of all, we can make it attachable. So that's a good first step. And secondly, we also need to do something else actually with the text field, because we have very nicely added that text field property there in the content part class, but that's not quite enough. As I said, that's actually not enough at all. That's just a shortcut that's not even needed, strictly speaking. So the next thing is that we actually need to configure the field here. So we need to tell Orchard that we want a text field on this content part. And how we do this is that we call this widthfield method, which needs a field name. So remember that you can attach the same type of fields multiple times onto the same content part. The field name here is the technical name of that instance. Let's call it like that. So in this case, that will be biography. That's not yet the type of the field, which is text field. So biography, again, we can use name of here and call it person part dot biography. All right, and the line here continues with such an alteration or a configuration delegate, similarly to how the content parts alter part definition method call is being used. So again, we can use something like field, and here we can actually specify everything. And now let's actually tell Orchard what type of field this is. And well, we need a field definition here, or we can also use the name of the content field, the name of the content field's type, so the string, and well, that's of course text fields, but we can use it in a similar way with name of. Yeah, and then we can also have a lot of other options. For example, we can add a display name. The display name, yes. That will be pretty much the same thing, but it could be something nicer than a technical name. We can also add a hint to the field, a hint that will be displayed on the admin when we are taking a look at the content type and looking at the content fields as well. So to do that, you will need to add settings, because content fields and content parts can have their own settings, which can be pretty much any class that you will use to model settings. And in this case, the settings for text field is text field settings. And here we have a couple of things, well, not a couple, it's just two. First, we can specify the hint, and secondly, we can also specify whether this field can be left empty when you are editing the content item or whether you require a value. We won't really require a value, but since the example is about the hint, let's add something here, like, I don't know, the person's biography. All right, and since this will be a biography, it can potentially be a bit bigger, not just a single line or something, not just 1-2 sentences, but probably a couple of paragraphs. Let's make the editor of this text field a bit bigger. Specifically, let's make it into a text area. And there is also a setting for that, and actually it's called width editor. That's not just for text fields, but also for a variety of fields. The variety of fields can define multiple editors, and with this config you can choose one of the editors. And the text field also defines a text area editor. So you can just select this as text area. Yep, and let's close everything here. This and this. And what did I forget here? And I mistyped this here. This should be with settings. Nice, it's a bit better. All right, the rest of the method here was already closed. So now we have the definition for the content part. We don't need to define anything else for the other properties here. And why is that? This is because Orchard operates with documents in its database, and we'll also take a look at the database a bit later. Pretty much all the data from all the content parts will be serialized into JSON documents in the SQL database, or whatever storage is used for content items. So the schema is kind of dynamic in that manner. We don't need to do anything on that front. But what we do need to do is that we'll need to also create our person page content type, as we have already talked about. And again, we'll need to use Content Definition Manager, but actually instead of doing that directly, I will use the OC alter type definition snippet here, which will allow us to call a similar alter method, but for content types. First, we'll need to specify the name of the content type, and again, it's the usual drill. We can specify all the alterations that can be that can be done here. For example, we can make the content type creatable. It's the same metadata that we have seen on the admin side, including making it listable. So we'll be able to create it quickly from the admin. We'll be able to list it, list such items on the admin too. And of course, very important, the content type should also include our own content part. And for that, we'll need to use with part. And with part name needs a content part name. So again, we can use the same name of trick with person part. So far so good. Let's actually run this application and let's see what happens. Our content part doesn't have any editor or display yet, so we won't be able to interact with it much. What we'll be able to do is pretty much just see how it can be managed from the admin as for the content definition goes. So let's go to the browser again. Here we have our app, and let's log into the admin to see whether our content part was actually made available on the admin there. It should show up in a variety of places. Alright, so we have a content parts list here. Let's see whether it's there. It is there, and if we edit, we should also be able to see that it has the biography field, which is properly a text field, and if we edit the text field, then we'll also be able to see the same settings that we have defined in the migration. You see, here we have the hint that we specified. It is not required, and well, the editor here, it's rather called multiline. The technical name is text area. Here the user-facing, human-readable name for the less technically inclined users is multiline. And we should also see our person page content type. And it's indeed here. So if I hit enter to enter its editor, we'll be able to see that it's indeed creatable and listable, so that worked. And it has the person part there, which person part is of course the same, but we don't really have anything in the content type part editor here. So the field and how we specify that field is a configuration on the content part. So if you use the same content part on multiple content types, it will still have the same text field with the same hint, with the same editor, with the same everything. What we can change here, and that's not much currently, but we can change here are the content part settings for just this content type, for just person pages. But we don't really need anything here. And that's about concludes the very, very basics of content part development. And the next step will be to actually make this usable, because although our person page is creatable here, and we can open its editor, we see that there's only a biography field here, because only the text field has an editor. We didn't create an editor for our own content part yet. We didn't yet create a display for it, so we can't really display anything on the front end either. And that's what we'll do next.